because of health freedom laws. And I don't know that I fully understood it, and I think there's a lot of other people out there that know it exists, but they don't know what it's all about. So we brought Ann here to tell you all about it and how it applies to you.
Yay.
So Ann Gillum is a Minnesota licensed attorney working 8 years at the National Health Freedom Action and National Health Freedom Coalition to protect your fundamental health freedom rights to practice and access complementary and alternative healthcare services. Wow, tiramisu. So these two nonprofit organizations were founded after another NHFA attorney, Diane Miller, was involved in defending a Minnesota farmer who was being prosecuted by the state of Minnesota for selling colostrum from his farm and telling people it would help them boost their immune system. The charge against the farmer was the unlicensed practice of medicine. Miller could not understand how the state could go after a farmer for practicing medicine and committed herself to changing the law so that the state could not do this to anyone else. When the case was over, Miller drafted and passed a new law for Minnesota healers. That law, the Minnesota Statute 164A, exempts complementary and alternative healthcare practitioners from charges for the unlicensed practice of medicine. She co-founded the organization soon after the passage of 146A, upon being asked by so many others to help pass a law in her state too. So please welcome Ann Gillum and take great notes on this.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I just want to start by saying thank you to AIA for inviting us to participate in your conference and for the opportunity to share this information with you today. That story about how Diane Miller decided to co-found this organization was shocking to me as a young attorney when she came in as a guest speaker at Hamline University School of Law, where I was taking a course called Complementary and Alternative Healthcare and Law. And the professor in that class used to prosecute unlicensed healthcare practitioners. I signed up for the class thinking that it was going to be the work that I actually get to do today, but she had a very different take on complementary and alternative healthcare. And so she brought in, who is now my boss, Diane Miller, to give a different perspective. And that was the course that I thought that I was taking, is how can we enable practitioners to be able to do what they do best. So I was fortunate to find the job opening after law school, and I've been with them ever since, except for the first 8 months. So I will move forward. So as the introduction said, we're National Health Freedom Action. We're a 501c4 nonprofit lobbying organization, and we also have a C3 organization as well, National Health Freedom Coalition. So the vision of our organizations is a healthy nation with empowered people making informed healthcare decisions. And the mission of both of those organizations is to promote access to all healthcare information, services, treatments, and products that people deem beneficial for their own health and survival, to promote legislative reform of the laws impacting the right to access, and to promote the health of the people of this nation. So, the primary way that we do that is by looking at the laws and regulations that are in place that either inhibit or enhance the ability of practitioners or consumers of complementary and alternative healthcare to be able to do that. So as an attorney, I really appreciate that we live in a country where what the laws say really matters. And at our organization, we want that to always be true. We want to have laws that make sense, and we want people to follow the laws that are on the books. But if the laws that are on the books are not good laws, then we want to encourage and educate the people of the United States about how they can change the laws to reflect the culture that they want to have, or reflect the freedom to live their life the way that they want to. So the laws that we primarily work with are healthcare practice acts, and even more specifically, the practice of medicine laws. In the United States, the words really matter. The words of our laws were put into place by individuals like you and me, and they can be changed and modified by individuals like you and me. And that is the voice of freedom of being a US citizen. And so I encourage you all to learn more about the legislative process in your state and to come visit Jerry Johnson, who's the other co-founder. She's here in the front, videoing, so she's not gonna raise her hand, but she and I are gonna be at the booth here throughout the weekend, so there's a lot to cover. If you have questions, hopefully we can take some of those at the end. Otherwise, come and see us and we can help you learn how to get involved. So, occupational licensing laws. It doesn't sound that exciting. I'll try and keep you guys interested here. I know you're all digesting your lunches, but it's really important stuff. So, at the state level, states have the jurisdiction to regulate, to protect the health, safety, and welfare of their citizens. The federal government regulates commerce, so they get to dictate laws for things going in between the states, but the states have the jurisdiction over what people are doing and saying to one another during their occupations. So if you are helping somebody with a health issue, we always encourage you to know what your state laws are. The federal laws, as I said, govern what you can say when you're selling a product and what goes on the labeling law, or what goes on the label itself, and sometimes that is interpreted to include marketing materials. So it's the federal government that regulates that, but it's states that regulate what you say to somebody who has a health issue or is looking to avoid having a health issue. So sometimes you're doing both. If you're selling essential oils or if you're selling herbs, you have to be compliant with both the state and federal laws. So I'm primarily going to talk to you about the state laws. So just to give you an example, we were contacted a couple years ago by a homeopath in the state of Washington who was being investigated for practicing medicine without a license and for practicing naturopathic medicine without a license. And she received a cease and desist letter that was threatening criminal charges against her for practicing homeopathy. She wasn't calling herself a doctor, she wasn't thinking that she was practicing medicine, she wasn't calling herself a naturopath, but it really doesn't matter what the individual practitioner thinks, it matters what the laws say. So let's take a look at the definition of the practice of medicine in Washington. It says, anyone who offers or undertakes to diagnose, cure, advise, or prescribe for any human disease, ailment, injury, infirmity, deformity, pain, or other condition, physical or mental, real or imaginary, by any means or instrumentality. So that is a very broad definition, and that's good for the profession. We want doctors to be able to do whatever they can to help people get well. We want them to have great latitude in what they can use to treat people. And that describes the many tools that they can have. However, if you look at this definition, you notice that it doesn't say if you're calling yourself a doctor. It doesn't say, and if you have a clinic, or if you have one of those Red Cross symbols on your door, then you're practicing medicine. No, it says anybody who does any of these things. So a quick show of hands, is there anybody in this room who has done anything within that definition?
Sure. Every day.
Okay, yep, and I too, my job before I went to law school was actually one of my favorite jobs, until this one, of course, and it was working at the local co-op, Lakeland's co-op in Minnetonka, and I was working in the health and beauty department and selling dietary supplements. And one of my favorite parts of that job was talking to people when they would come in and say, oh, I'm struggling with this, and I would recommend things like crazy. And while I was doing that without knowing the laws, I have, in hindsight, now realized I could have been charged with practicing medicine without a license. So let's take a look at another state, or another example of who we've been contacted by. So in 2017, there was a group of homeopaths who were interested in opening up a healing center in their state, and they were checking out their local business licensing laws, and they were told by their attorney that they should not go forward because they could be charged with practicing medicine without a license. They were surprised, confused, and I'm not sure how they ended up finding us, but fortunately they did, and we sometimes need to be the bearer of bad news, and we showed them their definition of the practice of medicine, in their state, which is diagnosing, relieving in any degree, or curing, or professing or attempting to diagnose, relieve, or cure a human disease, ailment, defect, or complaint, whether physical or mental, or of physical or mental origin, by attendance or by advice, or by prescribing or furnishing a drug, a medicine, an appliance, manipulation, a method, or therapeutic agent whatsoever, or in any other manner unless otherwise provided by the statutes of this state. So that's the definition of the practice of medicine in Maine, and in our research we found that all states have a very similar definition. And these licensing laws are the strictest form of regulation. So not only does it provide a definition of what the practice of medicine is, it also requires a license to do so. And if you don't have the license, and you're doing anything within that broad definition, then you can be shut down for the unlicensed practice. So licensure laws also do restrict titles, and the same way that certification laws will. So you'll see in some states that have just title protection for a registered dietitian. Licensing laws are a step above that. They're the strictest form of regulation. They prohibit titles, but they also prohibit practice. And they set forth requirements for the qualifications, including educational qualifications that you need in order to do anything within that broad definition. Oh, that's helpful. Thank you. Okay, perfect. So currently in every state where they have a licensing law, there are generally some exemptions. The typical exemptions are for other licensed healers. So when the Medical Practice Acts went forward, inevitably the chiropractors came up and said, well, we want our own licensing law, let's exempt us. And then there were the nurses who said, well, we need our own licensing law to protect us. And some states also have exemptions not just for licensed people, but in Maine they looked at the exemptions there, and it says nothing in this chapter may be construed as to affect or prevent the practice of the religious tenets of the church in administration to the sick or suffering by mental or spiritual means. So if you belong to a church or you're practicing under your religious tenets, you could claim to be operating under an exemption in a defense of being charged with practicing medicine without a license, but for the majority of holistic or complementary and alternative healthcare practitioners, that exemption would not apply to them. So rather than coming forward with a licensing law for all complementary and alternative healthcare professions, our organization works to get an exemption. So not a new licensing law to add into the exemption list under Medical Practice Acts, but an exemption for all complementary and alternative healthcare healers. An attempt at a solution that came forward in Maine, where those homeopaths were wanting to open up a clinic, is this bad bill that we tried to defeat, and we did successfully defeat that. That was legislative document 1384, and this was a bill that just last session tried to define a holistic healthcare practitioner as not the licensed massage people, not those licensed dietitians, but anybody who engages in clinical aromatherapy, uses or makes recommendations for the use or consumption of essential oils to support wellness, and it went on with D, E, and F, and G, and was trying to claim all of the currently unlicensed complementary and alternative healthcare professions and lump them into one holistic healthcare practitioner licensing law. We were very upset about seeing that bill come forward. If you want to go to our website, you can check out some of the further language in there. But that bill was trying to create the strictest form of regulation for aromatherapists, for herbalists, for all of holistic healthcare practitioners. If you look at some of the eligibility requirements on the slide, I'm sure it's probably pretty small in your handouts, but down toward the bottom under 1A, it was saying you need to either have a doctoral degree to do aromatherapy, 1,800 hours of supervision, or you could have a master's degree in the last 10 years and then 24 credits of blah, 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 blah. And it went on and on and on, dictating what you needed to do. And then there was more, 2, 3, 4. These are some of the requirements that Maine, some of the activists in Maine were trying to get enacted into law. We have a different solution. We believe that the state's jurisdiction should only be able to regulate things that threaten the health, safety, welfare. That's a constitutional principle, and we don't believe that herbs, aromatherapy, the energy medicine, holistic health coaching, we don't believe that any of that rises to the level of harm requiring state licensure. So instead, what we have been working to try and pass in every state, and most recently did so in the state of Maine, is to create a safe harbor practitioner exemption bill. That's the term that we call it. In Maine, it was LD 364, an act to establish the right to practice complementary and alternative healthcare. And that was passed into law in June and just went into effect last week. Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Yeah, he was a great sponsor. He was actually married to a homeopath, so he was a great person to carry the bill forward. And oftentimes it is a bad bill that will get people motivated to try and get a positive bill on the books. So a lot of the times that we get contacted by practitioners or consumers of complementary and alternative healthcare, it's because a new licensing law comes forward and they're going, how can we defeat this? And we say, well, you can defeat it in lots of different ways, and it would be even better to secure your freedom by establishing a new law, these safe harbor practitioner exemption laws that say that anyone who's delivering complementary and alternative healthcare practices can't be charged criminally for unlicensed practice of a licensed healthcare act as long as you avoid a list of prohibited acts and as long as you comply with the disclosures. So we have a list of all the laws on our state that have passed in 11 states now. So you can see the examples of the language of these new laws, but generally the prohibited acts are things like you can't puncture the skin, you can't tell people to go off the prescriptions or recommendations by their licensed healthcare practitioner, you can't give out prescription-only drugs or devices. So very basic common sense things that most practitioners are already abiding by, and then you need to comply with the disclosure requirements in the law. So those are things, again, that most practitioners are already doing, providing your name, your business address, contact information, telling people that you're not a licensed healthcare practitioner. You can't represent yourself as an MD. So very straightforward concepts about being not misleading and non-harmful. And so that's really the essence of these safe harbor exemption bills, is saying all of these gentle healing modalities can be freely practiced, and you can't be shut down for practicing a licensed act as long as you're not misleading somebody or causing harm. So in Maine now, as I said, they have this new law that says a person who provides complementary or alternative healthcare services in accordance with this subchapter, but who is not licensed, certified, or registered in this state as a healthcare professional or practitioner does not violate any law relating to the licensing of healthcare professionals as long as this person complies with the requirements of the subchapter. And that was, the requirements are again the disclosures and the prohibited acts. This is an image of two of the wonderful homeopaths at one of their lobby days. It's called in the Hall of Flags Day, or Hall of, yeah. So these are two of the practitioners who were there trying to educate legislators about the need for this bill and how it's a solution for the economic freedom and for the health freedom of consumers and practitioners in their state. They were primarily working as just grassroots activists. Toward the end, they did hire a lobbyist, but this bill moved really fast. In some states, we've been working with practitioners and consumers for a decade and don't get the bill passed yet. But in Maine, it happened within a year and a half. So that was amazing to see, and those are two of the practitioners who were there lobbying the bill along the way. Another state that we are working with is Wisconsin. Wisconsin right now has a bill that was just released for co-sponsorship last week. As you can see at the top of that slide, we've been working with them since 2011. And in that state, they're wishing to protect herbalists, homeopaths, traditional naturopaths, holistic health coaches, and we get asked by the legislators, why do we need this bill? Nobody's being shut down, or who's being shut down under the current laws? And we try and show them that it's not just whether or not people can be shut down, it's or whether or not they're actually being shut down. We don't want laws on the books that say that they can. So if you look at the definition of the practice of medicine in Wisconsin, you can see it's there. It's pretty similar to the ones that I've read earlier, but to examine into the fact, condition, or cause of human health or disease, or to treat, operate, prescribe, or advise by any means or instrumentality, to apply principles or techniques of medical sciences in the diagnosis or prevention of any of the conditions, to penetrate, pierce, or sever tissues of the human being, to offer, undertake, or attempt, or do, or hold oneself out in any manner as able to do any of those acts described in this subsection. So if you're doing any of those things in the state of Wisconsin right now, you need a license. If you don't have a license, you could be shut down. So we've been working with a group there since a bad dietitian licensing law came out in 2009. We finally convinced them to not just defeat these bad bills that are coming up, but to actually be proactive and try and enact this exemption solution. So they have 2 strong sponsors there, and they're also working with a high-paid lobbyist. So fingers crossed, this is the year that Wisconsin passes, and they will be the 12th health freedom state. Oh, sure, yeah, and I have it on a slide. I'll show you the list of the 11 states that have successfully passed in just a second. The other state that we are working with currently right now that has a bill going forward is in Massachusetts. This group came to us when there was a bad bodywork licensing bill that was introduced. There were a bunch of energy healers and Reiki practitioners and Feldenkrais.
Too.
And yeah.
They're actually, they're having a lobby day because they're trying to push this forward.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Senate 168, we've been meeting with the senators, and they're determined because of human trafficking to push forward the body.
Yeah. The comment, if you guys couldn't hear that, is regarding this bodywork licensing bill. So the first time that this bill was introduced was several years ago, and each session, the sponsor of that bodywork licensing bill just kind of reintroduces it in a similar form. It's being put forth under the guise of anti-human trafficking protection, because the state's claim, or the sponsor's claim, is that the human traffickers are using body worker facilities or massage well, not massage, they have their own licensing law for massage, but are using these energy medicine shops as a front for human trafficking. There's little evidence to support that. There are bad actors in every profession, and just because you license something or just because somebody goes to school doesn't mean that they can't be engaged in illegal behavior. So that's not surprising to a lot of the practitioners who are opposing that, but it's really about getting up to the Capitol and educating the legislators about a different way to look at solving that problem through criminal enforcement protection laws or transparency laws. States have gone about it in a lot of different ways, but the activists in Massachusetts are really, really involved. There's a group that's specifically working to oppose S-168, and then there's a group that's working really hard to promote this safe harbor exemption bill. The safe harbor, well, and the definition of the practice of medicine in Massachusetts is, again, very broad. So it includes even prevention, alleviation, physical or mental, relief of diseases. Yeah, it's theirs is in the rules, not in the statute. So sometimes the state will say, medical board, you get to define your practice of medicine. And whether it's in the statutes or whether it's in the rules that a board writes, it's extremely broad. They do have current exemptions in the law, and the same thing for the body workers right now. There is a massage licensing law. A lot of Reiki and energy practitioners are currently exempt, and that bodywork licensing law is trying to remove that exemption and lump all body workers into their own licensing law. There's an exemption in the Medical Practice Act currently for domestic administration of family remedies, for clairvoyance, hypnotism, Christian Scientists. These people cannot be charged with practicing medicine without a license. Each of those words that are in there were fought hard by citizens or lobbyists to get in there. And so we are trying to do the same thing for herbalists, aromatherapists, holistic health coaches. We need to get an exemption in each of these states. And that's our primary goal. In Massachusetts, the bills that are moving forward right now are House Bill 3660 and Senate File 665. They're just companion bills. They say the same thing. And we found out just last week that the bills were scheduled for a hearing. So when they first get introduced, they get referred to a committee, and then you kind of wait to get a hearing scheduled. And so these bills will be heard in the Joint Public Health Committee on November 19th. And so right now we're working with that group to help prepare testimony, to help them, have their lineup, to help get their vote count and try and assess which way the legislators are gonna go and try and convince the people who are maybes to the yes side, and all of that exciting stuff. So yeah, hopefully Massachusetts and Wisconsin join the list of safe harbor states by the end of this session. This is a photo of some of the Health Freedom Action Massachusetts activists at their Capitol. They are not working with a lobbyist this year. They did in 2015-2016 session, but some lobbyists cost a lot of money. So if groups are not in a position to fund a lobbyist themselves or aren't set up to do mass fundraising, that's okay. We still want to work with you and encourage you to be your own lobbyist, and it can be just as successful. It may not happen as quickly, but Maine is a great example where they passed in a year and a half, and they only had a lobbyist working for them during the last month, and she was only working 8 hours a month. So it can be done with just citizens and without a lot of money, and that's what we're here to do, is help you learn how to do that and teach you about how it can be done. Maryland is a sad state, so we've been talking about primarily the practice of medicine, but there are also practice of naturopathic medicine laws that are on the books. So not only can practitioners be shut down under the Medical Practice Act, you can also be shut down for practicing naturopathy without a license, or even dietetics without a license. So this is the definition of the practice of naturopathic medicine in Maryland. And as I said earlier, licensing laws are the strictest form of regulation, so they do come with penalties associated with them. And in Maryland, it says right there, it's a felony to practice naturopathic medicine without a license, and you can get a $10,000 fine and civil fines of no more than $50,000, if that's any comfort to you. Yeah, so these are serious laws that do come with criminal charges, and a lot of the times the legislators are not the only ones who need to be educated on it. As I said, we're oftentimes the bearer of bad news because it's a lot of consumer or practitioners who don't know about these laws. And so, you'll see a lot of schools offering these certificate programs and talking about their scope of practice or their standards of care for their programs, and that's really different than the state laws. So just because a school says now you can go out and offer your services, that doesn't mean that the state law will allow you to hang out your shingle as a practitioner. Or if you do so, you could be subject to these laws. And they're not going after everyone. It's really if you get big enough or successful enough where they're going to notice you. Or if you're giving a speech and somebody from the dietetics board comes in and so I don't want to totally scare everybody, but it is a real potential that you could be shut down under these laws, and so that's why we want to change them. Kansas is also a bad law in their state. These are words that we really want to see removed from the law. It says that recognizing that the practice of the healing arts is a privilege granted by legislative authority and is not a natural right of individuals. So that is in their legislative intent in their Medical Practice Act. Wisconsin also has that in their legislative intent for their Medical Practice Act, and we strongly disagree with that. In Georgia, very similar. Diagnosis, treatment, suggestion, recommendation, any form of treatment. So if you're wondering if your state has something similar, the answer is yes. Here it is in Alabama. I'm not sure where everybody is from here, so if you have questions about your specific state, I can help you find your statute if you want to stop by our booth. So instead, we create the broad exemptions. New Mexico is one of those safe harbor free states, and here are the list of practices that can now be practiced freely without being charged with practicing medicine without a license. So complementary and alternative healthcare services means the broad domain of complementary and alternative healing methods and treatments, including you'll see number 2 says aromatherapy on there, and it goes through. Not all of the states that have passed a safe harbor practitioner exemption law include a list, but it's not necessary. You can just say everybody who's doing something that's not prohibited. And so if you do look at our website and look at the language of the laws, there are some differences, but they do all accomplish the same purpose, even if you don't see aromatherapy written into the law. Nevada is another state where they did include a list, and so now these practices can be practiced freely in the states, and you can't be shut down. If you look at the G, you'll see that the colostrum therapy is in there. That is, again, kind of goes back to the introduction story about the organization's founder working to protect a farmer here in Minnesota who was being charged for practicing medicine without a license. So Diane was excited to see the word colostrum therapy get put into law in Minnesota, and then also it was included in Nevada as well. And we think it's really neat because this is the only place in the laws where these words are included, where these words are acknowledged, and these practitioners are given the protection to help people get well. So this is a photo of the contract lobbyist that was working there and the herbalist Jim Jenks in Nevada. So this is the list you've been waiting for, of the states that are currently free states. So it's Oklahoma, Idaho, Minnesota, and just to correct one thing from earlier, it's Minnesota 146A is the statute. I think in the bio or in my introduction we said 164, but it's 146A in case you're looking that up. Rhode Island, California, Louisiana, Arizona has a limited one for homeopaths, New Mexico, Colorado, Nevada, and as I said, most recently, Maine. And we would like to see this list get bigger and include all the states. So that's a map that shows the safe harbor states are in red, so Maine should actually be changed to red. Then the others, mine's not even colored, just a second. Okay, so the dark green they've recently introduced or they have legislation pending. And then the light green are states that have introduced legislation between 2004 and 2013. And if it's white, then that means that the state has not gone forward to introduce a safe harbor exemption law. And on our website, we do have a list of state organizations or of contacts in the different states who are interested in working on this. So if you want to join and support their efforts, that's a great first place to look to see if there are other people who are wanting to work on it with you. Otherwise, give us a call and we're happy to help facilitate you getting a group going in that state. And we will, the way that we work with groups is really just weekly conference calls. We'll teach you how to, we'll go through the bill line by line, word by word, and teach you about how to find a sponsor, your individual state legislative process, help you with preparing testimony for public hearings, help with coalition building, send out alerts, form letters to send to your legislators, and be with you all the way, hopefully through passage into law. So that's the map. As I said, I'm an attorney. We're only licensed in the state of Minnesota, but there aren't requirements. You don't need to be an attorney to lobby. You don't need to be have any experience in public policy to get involved in this. It can be a little daunting, but it really is. It really is exciting, and it's a great learning opportunity. I wish I had some quotes from the people in Maine who worked on this, but it can be. Maine was a great example because it happened so quickly, but it does require some stamina. But it's a great learning opportunity, and it's a good thing to know as an American citizen, I believe. So, as a nonprofit, we work on a lot of issues, not just related to practitioner and consumer access to complementary and alternative healthcare, but we try and be there as a resource for people in the broader health freedom movement issues. So practitioner rights is primarily one of them, but we also work on vaccine exemption rights, GMO labeling, geoengineering, electromagnetic frequency, glyphosate, regenerative agriculture projects, access to raw milk. Again, it goes back to our mission of wanting to promote and protect access to all of the healthcare products, services, information that people deem beneficial for them, or not beneficial, they like to avoid. So, how am I doing on time? Okay. So we can talk a little bit about the federal laws. As I said at the beginning, the federal government gets to regulate products. Something that I think is, here's just a broad example of some of the federal issues that we're involved in. So access to homeopathic remedies, GMO labeling. Some of you might be familiar with the passage of the DARK Act, which said that states can't go forward and pass their own labeling laws. There were several states who had tried to give consumers the right to know, and the federal government has said, no, you can't. Vaccine mandates, usually those are just state by state, but really it is coming from the CDC and ACIP, and states generally just follow what the federal government is recommending. We get involved on dietary supplement issues. Several years ago, they put out a draft guidance for new dietary ingredients. People have been contacting us about geoengineering and about electromagnetic frequencies, like smart meters in their home and different Wi-Fi emitting products that they would like to avoid. So those are some of the other areas that we try and help advise people on. So I'm not going to get into it too much, but I just think that it's interesting here that you'll see that the definition of drug on the federal level is very similar to the definition of the practice of medicine at the state level. So the term drug, if you look at Part B, means articles intended for use in the diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease in man or other animals. So that should look very similar to what we were just reading before. That's Part B. Part C is articles other than food intended to affect the structure or any function of the body of man or other animals. So this is related to what you say about a product. So you can't say ashwagandha will cure your cancer. That would be violating Part B. The other than food part, in parentheses, in Part C, is the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act. In 1994, that was an act that was hard fought and successfully won by health freedom activists to get this other than food put into the definition of a drug. And they were successful in getting that other than food in there, but that other than food, because it's in Part C and not in Part B, means that you can only talk about food in a way that's related to impacting structure, function of the body. So with dietary supplements, with herbs, with botanicals, even though you can talk about structure, function, you still can't talk about curing or treating or preventing. So that may be familiar to some of you. I'm not sure if you've had any federal compliance or selling compliance training in your past, but if so, this is where those rules come from. It's from the federal definition of a drug, and that's the citation at the bottom if you're interested in looking it up in the US code. So the other than food includes a dietary supplement. Dietary supplement is a vitamin, a mineral, an herb, or other botanical, an amino acid, dietary substance for use by man to supplement the diet by increasing the total dietary intake, a concentrate, metabolite, constituent, extract, or combination of any ingredient mentioned above. So dietary supplements, as I said, are regulated as food, not as drugs, and they're generally regarded as safe unless proven otherwise, and the burden is on the government to prove otherwise. So it's not for every vitamin herb. You know, if you guys are familiar with ephedra, that was taken off, and it was the burden of the government to prove that it was not generally regarded as safe. For dietary supplements, they were grandfathered in things that were marketed before 1994, and that's when the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act was passed into law, and they kind of just grandfathered everything that had been marketed on on the market prior to that date was grandfathered in, and now the new dietary ingredient draft guidance that was issued several years ago was challenging what substantiation needs to be provided about whether or not it was safely used or in existence and marketed before 1994. So literally companies have been trying to go through old packaging materials and show that, no, this was included in a recipe or in a formulation way back then. It's a strange cutoff date. It seems very arbitrary, but those are the laws that we are working with right now. And so we believe that new draft guidance has had a negative impact on access to dietary supplements, and we've been tracking that. So I want you to think about who is representing you, because it really does take concerned citizens and people who are paying attention to be involved in this process. And we need to be at the table long term if we want to make a difference to protect health freedom. Even if a state goes forward and passes one of their safe harbor exemption laws, or even if we have the win of getting the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act in 1994, there are constant, continual new attempts to change and erode those freedoms that were hard fought and won. So even in Idaho, where they had a long-standing health freedom law, when they went forward with their naturopathic licensing law a couple years ago, initially there wasn't a reference to their health freedom law, and so you need to constantly monitor and make sure that any new legislation going forward refers back to that safe harbor exemption, or you need to try and defeat that bill. So we want to work with leaders who understand health freedom, who want health freedom, who are teaching about health freedom, who are living it themselves, and we're here to work with you. This is a quote from my boss, Diane Miller, encouraging you to be an agent of change, that the laws and customs must be carefully reviewed, revised, and even repealed if necessary, and new laws created to reflect the development, evolution, and spiritual maturization of a people. Sure, yeah, I'd happily take some questions if you guys have them. Okay, great. Do you need this? Yes. And I didn't touch on it much, but the dietitian licensing laws are very similar as well. If you guys are interested in this, or you don't believe some of the stuff that I'm saying, you go, oh, that can't be true. Well, there's a case that just came out of the Northern District of Florida, Pensacola Division. It's called Castillo versus Phillip, and this is a holistic health coach who had been practicing in the state of California, where they do have a safe harbor exemption. She's a wife of a military man, and he was relocated down to Florida, and she continued her practice there as a holistic health coach. And unfortunately, somebody from the dietetics board sent her an email pretending to be an interested potential new client. She sent back a form, an intake health questionnaire form, and based off of that email interaction alone, the board decided to issue her a cease and desist letter. This decision, she challenged that threat of charges and wanted to continue her practice, and just in July of this year, the first level court, the trial court, found for the dietetics board and said, and really, I want to tell her, stop wasting your money on these attorneys and change the law, because really the courts are held to what the law says. And so based off of the definition of the practice of dietetics in her state, she was practicing dietetics. So unfortunately, she lost her case against them and is going to go forward and appeal. But unfortunately, I don't see the appeals court doing anything different, because the words really matter, and it's the court's job to just enforce the words. So that's what we're here to do, is to help you change the words in your state. Yeah, questions, please.
Thank you. I'm naturally loud, so you know if I'm too loud with this. I work in a very narrow niche, and most of my clients are not in my state. So do I worry about every state I have a client in, or the state in which I live? How can I protect myself given that scenario?
Well, first I'm going to say I'm an attorney who's only licensed in the state of Minnesota, and I don't take individual clients, so I can't advise you legally. So that's my big disclaimer before I say anything else. For practitioners who are practicing across state lines, you should try and be familiar with the telemedicine laws in your state. Not every state has adopted telemedicine laws. However, telemedicine laws are generally drafted with the understanding that they apply only to licensed healthcare practitioners, people who are legally able to help people who are trying to get well. So if you're a licensed healthcare practitioner trying to practice across state lines, people are, more and more states are getting clear on choice of law statutes and whether it would be the home state for the practitioner or the home state for the client or the patient, and which would apply in different situations. But that would, those laws generally apply to phone calls, emails, video conferencing, and all of that. Yeah, so it probably, yeah, it would, that's all I'll say. Anyone else?
So I'm down in Georgia, and I know that you posted a little bit about Georgia, and I remember when I was first going through school, herbalist first, but now aromatherapy is a part of what I do as well. I remember thinking, God, there's nothing in Georgia. Like, there's no health food act in Georgia. And I remember looking into it, and it was something that was trying to come through in 2012, and then it just like fell off the face of the earth. And nobody's ever heard of it, and I totally like haven't thought about it again, because I've been in business for almost 2 years now, doing what I do, but like they could totally come in and say, you need to shut your stuff down, and that scares the living daylights out of me. Is there anything that, do you know right now happening in Georgia that would support this at all? I mean, and then I equate it to like going to GNC. You go to GNC and you tell those people that don't know anything about health except for they're getting paid whatever they're getting paid, and you ask them because you have heartburn, they're suggesting something for heartburn. I mean, how is that? I'm freaking out.
Georgia does have a history of a group effort attempting to pass a safe harbor exemption bill that was led by Marge Roberts. I'm not sure if that name is familiar to you. Okay, and they were having lobby days. Like literally, she rented a room at the Capitol and was having diverse set of complementary alternative healthcare practitioners there offering services to the legislators. And the legislators were loving it. They were coming down and getting energy healing. They were getting reflexology, herbs, all of that. But not enough political power there to pass that into law. We did have a couple conference calls last session with some activists there who are trying to get a new group started. But you're definitely right. It was about 2012, 2013 when the group that that practitioner was leading kind of dissolved. I mean, it does, as I said before, it takes a lot of stamina. It can take a long time to get the laws passed, and so sometimes the leader of a group or a whole group themselves will disband after trying it. And sometimes that makes sense. You know, sometimes the political climate in a state isn't ready for it. Whether it's a certain majority party who's in place. I mean, we think of these laws, or the safe harbor exemption legislation, as being bipartisan, and it has passed in states where Republicans have been in the majority party or where Democrats have been in the majority party. So we don't find it to be a partisan issue, but in some states the culture just isn't ready for it to go forward, or if there is a nurse or an MD who's on the healthcare committee that the bill was assigned to, sometimes they can have such strong feelings against complementary and alternative healthcare that they won't even give the bill a hearing. And if a bill doesn't get a hearing, it doesn't get a chance to move out and get voted on the floor and become law. So in some states, it really is about timing and conserving the energy and the resources and going forward again when the political climate is more ready for this type of.
Something recently happening in Georgia?
Well, there's no legislation currently introduced.
Somebody's doing, you said you talked to somebody?
Yep, there's a group that's trying to get started. So they would certainly appreciate all the members and support. So if you wanna give me your email, I can connect you to that group and like you could start joining the conference calls. And then to address your question about the people at GNC and giving health advice, ideally those people who are talking about the products, they would be following just the federal labeling law. So anything that they are talking about would be related to the structure or function. So structure function claims can be anything from it supports, normal blood pressure, or it supports cholesterol levels within these healthy ranges. So you can talk about normal structures of the body, like bones, or you can talk about functions of the body, but you can't talk about curing or preventing or anything related to diseases. So, but if you're talking specifically to somebody who is sick or somebody who says, I have this type of problem, help me with that, that is getting into practicing medicine or practicing dietetics. It's the federal law regulates just what you say when you're selling a product related to just that product. If you're giving advice to somebody based off of an ailment or something that they're specifically dealing with themselves, then you're practicing a profession. So sometimes people are thinking that they're just doing the federal labeling laws and talking about the benefits of the product, but if you know that the person in front of you is specifically dealing with a certain issue and you're giving them advice or recommending products to help with that specific situation, that would be occupational licensing laws that would govern that.
So then what do? Do you just give up and close shop and wait until the law supports you, or do you keep on going, doing the best you can to follow the right legal language and hope to hell that the person in front of you isn't an undercover dietitian?
Yeah, every practitioner needs to wrestle with that answer for themselves. It is, as I said, it's tough to be the bearer of bad news, but it really is, it's up to your own risk level. People have different tolerances for risk, so some practitioners won't advertise their services. They'll just rely on word of mouth as a way to keep their head down. There are other practitioners who aren't aware of the laws, and so they're out there advertising, doing their stuff, and maybe, and if they don't get caught, then they don't get caught. But we really want the laws to reflect what people want access to and what's happening in the culture currently. So I don't have a more hopeful answer for you other than work with us to change the laws in your state so you don't need to be afraid or keep your head down anymore.
Which probably answers some of my question. When the Alliance was originally started, one of our goals was to be a self-regulating aromatherapy association so that when government infringement did occur, that we could stand up and say, well, we're self-regulating, this is what we've determined. And I think that came to mind because on one of your slides you were talking about, how the government came in and said you need X amount of hours of study in this and this and this. And it's, how could they determine that if they're working outside of our profession? It should be our profession that is helping to develop that. So we can work with these teams to help in a particular area.
You can work with these teams?
Well, like for example, in Georgia, if Georgia was to say, well, you need to do 1,600 hours of study in aromatherapy and you need 500 hours of A&P, is this a place where maybe the Alliance of International Therapists can step in with the team that's trying to pass these laws and say, it's really not that, we really need maybe closer to 200 hours of study and 50 hours of A&P and so forth, because we've been doing it for so long and have a model for it.
Sure. You certainly could. That's not the approach that we would recommend because we don't believe that aromatherapy or holistic health coaching or herbalism rises to the level of harm requiring state regulation. Like as a constitutional principle, we don't want the state dictating who can pretty much use free speech. I mean, we want people to be able to share what they know, and we don't think that the state should be able to limit that. So we're certainly in favor of trade organizations wanting to, professionalize their profession, and we get that. And coming up with your ethics, and if you're going to issue a certificate to a practitioner, we understand that you want to have a statement from their practitioner that they're gonna be abiding by a certain set of rules or, but we don't want the state to dictate where a practitioner needs to get their education or how many hours. We want it to be the consumer to be able to decide whether they want to go to somebody who had a weekend crash course in herbalism. They can go see them as long as it's fully disclosed. We think it should be up to the consumer to be able to decide. Or if they want to go to a Tibetan grandma who's never had any formal education and has just learned everything from her grandma and generations on, we want the consumer to be able to choose. For things that aren't rising to the level of harm, the state shouldn't have a say in where you get your training, how many hours. So certainly trade organizations can be involved in those conversations internally about what they want their practitioners to have and how they want them to be interacting, but that isn't something that we would promote being written into statute.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.